off of himself and they turned to the Lord. I love that. They focused on Jesus. Remember what Jesus said? Folks will see your good works and they'll give glory to God the Father in heaven. Peter's doing that. He kept them from focusing on anything else. And so Aeneas is healed, and word spreads that Peter, in the name of Jesus, has done this incredible miracle. In verse 36, it's like you would think, oh, this is the next story. It's not. It's still part of the same story. Verse 36 says, at Joppa, there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. So we shift 12 miles to the west. We go from Lydda to Joppa. Joppa, by the way, today is known as Jaffa. It's a suburb of Tel Aviv. It's still around today. It's shown up in the Bible in multiple places. In the days of Solomon, the cedars of Lebanon were floated down the coast from Tyre to Joppa. The prophet Jonah, when he said, I don't want to go to Nineveh, I need to get on a boat, he went to Joppa to find a boat bound for Tarshish. And in Joppa, there's now a church of the Lord. Probably begun about the same time as the one in Lydda. Probably begun the same way, whether that was someone preaching the gospel in that area, whether it was those saints who were scattered from Jerusalem carrying the gospel. It probably started that way. But at Joppa, we meet a disciple named Tabitha. A couple of interesting things. First off, this is only the second woman we've met who's named after Pentecost. Anybody remember the first named woman after Pentecost in the church? What's that? Lydia. We haven't met Lydia yet. We haven't met Priscilla yet. Y'all are thinking of good examples. Think of a bad example. Who's a Christian? Sapphira. That's the only other woman we've had named yet. Sapphira and her husband Ananias. And so you couldn't have a bigger contrast between Sapphira and Tabitha. But these are the first two women named in Acts after the day of Pentecost. Tabitha, both the name Tabitha and Dorcas mean gazelle. Gazelles were known for their beauty and grace, and it was a common name. And sure enough, here is a woman who is beautiful and gracious. She's full of good works and charitable deeds that she did. F.F. Bruce translates that sentence there. It says, she spent all her time in the performance of good works and acts of kindness. She's just one of those really, really good people. Everybody that knows Tabitha is blessed by her. She is always working, and she loves to do charitable deeds. That means she does stuff that she doesn't get paid back for. She does it out of the grace of her heart. Verse 37, but it happened in those days that she became sick and died. It's likely that lots of Christians have died since the church began about 12 years before this. We're about in the first 10 to 12 years of the church. Christians have died, but Tabitha is the first named Christian to die of natural causes. We've seen Ananias and Sapphira die. That wasn't natural. We've seen Stephen die. That wasn't natural. But Tabitha dies apparently of natural causes. And she simply reaches an age, or her health reaches a point where she does not continue living. And Tabitha dies, and when they washed her, they laid her in an upper room. This is the process they would begin to do for a body that was going to be buried. Within the city limits of Jerusalem, bodies were supposed to be buried the same day that they died. In the countryside, that was not followed, and so they're going to have a longer service for Tabitha, a time of mourning, a time of remembering her. And so they prepare her body, and they lay her in an upper room. And verse 38 says, and since Lydda was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Man, there's a whole lot in this verse. But first off, notice they said, hey, we're close to Lydda. And we know that Peter is in Lydda. And so they said, let's send word to Peter. How did they know Peter was in Lydda? What's that? Everybody's talking about what? Which was Aeneas is walking. Yeah. So the miracle of Aeneas walking leads to the word spreading. And now in a town a few miles away, they all know, hey, Peter is in Lydda. You see how it begins to connect. What God is doing in Aeneas' life, what God is doing in Lydda overflows into Joppa. And suddenly they send word because they want Peter, and they say, come quickly, don't delay in getting here. If you've been a Christian any length of time, if you've read the book of Acts, you know how this story ends. But for the moment, I want you to put that out of your mind as best you can. And pretend that you are one of the disciples in Joppa. Hey, Tabitha has died, and Peter is just one town away. Peter, hurry and come. Why do you want Peter to come? So Marlena says they had faith. Colby says he could heal her. But Tabitha is dead. She's not sick. She's not paralyzed. She's not deaf or blind or mute. She's dead. So Keith kind of skips ahead. He knows the rest of the story. He said, Peter can bring her back in Jesus' name. We have no reference or record to any of the apostles raising the dead yet. They can heal the sick, but death was always kind of a line, you know. Now, Jesus crossed that line, but none of the apostles had done it yet. So Marlena said they had faith. I think they did have faith. I don't know that they were expecting Peter to bring her back from the dead. I think they just knew, man, she was the heartbeat of this church. She did so much good. This church is hurting in an incredible way. Send for Peter. If he's out strengthening the churches, we need Peter. Maybe they want Peter to preach her funeral. Maybe they just want some encouragement from Peter and some guidance. What do we do? Tabitha's gone. And here's David's opinion. We real clear on that? I want you to hear, this is my opinion. I don't think they were expecting a resurrection. Because Stephen didn't get raised from the dead. I mean, if you're just looking at who deserves to get raised from the dead, Stephen, man, he died preaching the gospel, and he stayed dead. We're going to see as persecution breaks out. James doesn't get raised from the dead, and he's an apostle. I mean, if you were just going to say who ought to get raised from the dead, Tabitha's great, and she goes on the list, but she doesn't make it to the top. There's people who would merit that more than Tabitha. So they want him to come quickly. So Marlene is exactly right. So the argument for what they're expecting is, don't delay.
Because they know he did something amazing.
Yeah.
Even though the disciples had done it before, they knew the story of Lazarus, and that was Jesus.
Well,
I can see some people saying,
yeah. So Marlene is right. Here's the flip side of that. Hurry, Peter, because maybe there's time. Remember, Jesus asked, how long has Lazarus been dead? And there was a myth. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but there was a rumor that arose of, there's a window. Because Jesus asked, how long has Lazarus been dead? There's a window. After that, Jesus can't raise him from the dead. That's not true. Read Revelation. We'll all get raised from the dead. But there was this idea that, hey, for 3 or 4 days, there was still hope. The spirit would linger around the body, and there's myths and legends about all of that the Jews told. So maybe that's what they're thinking. Maybe they're hopeful. Regardless, they want Peter. In verse 39, Peter arose and went with them. And when he had come, they brought him into the upper room, and the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. So they go get Peter, they bring him in, and as he's there, here he's in the room with Tabitha. They call her Dorcas here, that's her Greek name, but I think Tabitha might have some extra meaning for us because of what happens next. And the widows are all gathering around saying, look what she made us. Maybe her ministry was to widows. Maybe that's just who's gathered right there. And they show off their tunics and garments. Anybody know what tunics and garments are? It's clothes. What's the difference? So a tunic is an inner garment, is an inner piece of clothing, and a garment is an outer piece of clothing. It's the inside and outside clothing. She took care of them. She made everything they needed. Alan? It was simply the way that they dressed, and certainly their environment was part of that, but they would have an inner garment and an outer garment. Jesus is going to talk about if somebody asks for your cloak, give it to him. You'll see sometimes folks running around in their inner garments, and that was what we would consider underwear. You didn't show that off. So it was disgraceful when they'd be running around in just those inner garments. But she made everything they needed. She took care of these widows. She had done what she could for them, and when those were in need, she sewed for them. When James is going to define pure and undefiled religion, he says, here's what it looks like. Visit orphans and widows in their distress. And to visit doesn't just mean go look at them. It means to help them. And here's a lady who did just that. And Peter says her name's Tabitha. In Aramaic, it means gazelle. It might even mean little gazelle. And Peter certainly seems to remember another time when he was with Jesus. And Jesus looked, and Peter might even remember when Jesus said, Talitha. It's not like Peter had a book on, hey, here's how to raise the dead, but he did have time with Jesus. And in Mark chapter 5 or Luke chapter 8, we meet Jairus, whose daughter has died. And Jesus goes up into that upper room where they've laid her out. And it sure seems like as Peter walks in, he just remembers that scenario. And he's going to raise Dorcas. You might wonder why. I mean, Stephen and James were dead. They didn't get raised. All we know is it served God's purpose to raise Tabitha on this occasion. And so Peter says, well, I'm going to do what Jesus did. So if you remember, the first thing Jesus does is he sends everybody out of the room. So when Peter comes in, verse 40, Peter put them all out. Clear the room. That's what Jesus did. Verse 40 says, Peter put them all out and knelt down and prayed. Jesus didn't pray before he raised Jairus' daughter, but he didn't have to pray because he was God. He was the power. But Peter knelt to pray, and then Peter would remember Jesus said, Talitha koum, little girl, arise. And so he looks and he says, Tabitha koum in Aramaic. Tabitha, arise. Almost the same word. It's literally one letter difference. And when Jesus said, little girl, arise, immediately she arose. Peter says, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. Like all the other New Testament miracles, this one is immediate and complete and convincing. And Peter remembered when the little girl sat up that Jesus took her by the hand. And so Peter, verse 41, he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. The saints and widows doesn't necessarily mean that the widows weren't Christians, but maybe it does mean that Tabitha's ministry was not limited just to Christian widows. Maybe it was to all the widows in the community, and some of them had yet to come to faith. We're not sure. But Peter calls them in because he wants to show them that Tabitha is alive. And so he presented her alive. J.W. McGarvey writes about this, and I love his comments on it. It's in his commentary on the book of Acts. He says, with a voice of authority and yet of tenderness, a voice which can be heard by the dead, Peter says to the cold body, Tabitha, arise. Her eyes open, and she sees Peter. Does she recognize him, or is he a stranger to her? We don't know. She sits up and looks him in the face. Not another word passes between them, but he gently gives her his hand and helps her to his feet. He calls in the saints and the widows, and there in her white shroud she stands before them alive. Peter came to weep with those who weep, but he remained to rejoice with those who rejoiced. And so Tabitha is alive. So far, every account of the death of a Christian has held a very special lesson for us. As Luke records these, we mentioned there's lots of other Christians that have died. But this is now the third time Luke has shown us a Christian passing away. The deaths of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5 reminded us God will not be mocked, and that even those who come to faith still have to choose to live faithfully. When Stephen was killed, the vision that he had reminded us that the Lord knows when his saints are oppressed, that he honors them. Remember Jesus standing to receive Stephen. And before we leave Dorcas, we learned that, first off, Peter heals Dorcas just as easily as he heals Aeneas. Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Get up and walk. Tabitha, arise. It's not any more difficult. It's not that, oh, this one requires a lot of power out of Peter and, oh, he's weak. That's not it. It's all the same because it's the power of God. It took one verse to tell of the healing of Aeneas. It takes one verse to tell of the raising of Dorcas. It takes no more power from God to raise the dead than it does to make the lame walk. There are no big, middle, and small miracles in the New Testament. Second, we see that Dorcas had no faith whatsoever to be healed. She had no ability to ask for this healing. She had no faith in Peter or in Jesus. At this point, Dorcas was dead. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about miracles today, and as they talk about miracles today, they'll say that your faith makes a difference in whether Jesus can do a miracle in your life. It's never about your power. It's about his power. And Dorcas does not have faith to be healed. She had no faith that Peter would heal her body or bring her back to life. It wasn't about her faith. It was about Peter's trust in the power of Jesus. And most importantly, the story's not over. You see, we might say, oh, look, see, he did the healing of Aeneas. There in chapter 9, at the first part, he healed Aeneas so that he could then set everything up to heal Tabitha. And that might be the point here as we go through Acts and look at what Peter's doing. We'd say, oh, this is it, that Peter we're showing off Peter's power to heal. And neither Aeneas nor Dorcas are the point of the story. The miracles are not the focus. Verse 42, and it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. That's the point of the story. Souls were saved. When you go back and look at Aeneas, some of you rightly pointed out, so all those who dwelled at Lydda and Sharon in that same region saw him and turned to the Lord. It wasn't that Aeneas could walk, it was that the power of God was among them and people believed on God. Verse 42, it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. So Peter sets out, by the way, on a missionary journey to encourage the saints, to strengthen the churches. What happens when you strengthen the church in a community? The church gains in membership. That's certainly the church grows. When the church is strengthened, the community looks, and the community turns to the Lord. The community believes on the Lord. When the community sees a strong church, it results in conversion. So even though Peter set out to say, I'm going to strengthen the church, when you strengthen the church, people see the power of the Lord, and souls are saved. In verse 43, so it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon, a tanner. Little tiny side note. And by the way, it reminds us that this story is still not over. This is just chapter 2. As we move on to Acts chapter 10 in just a minute, you're going to see that we're continuing with the focal point of what God is doing. What he did with Aeneas in Lydda, what he did with Dorcas in Joppa is all setting things up. But it says Peter stayed with Simon, a tanner. Luke gives us Peter's address because we're going to need that in the next chapter, okay? That's why you need to know that. And Simon is a tanner. For Jews, working with leather, working with animal skins was unclean. So Simon would not have been welcomed in the synagogue. He was not allowed to participate in any of the religious exercises of the Jewish community. He would have been excluded from that by his profession. He was always unclean because he was always handling the skins of dead animals. In fact, a tanner was considered an unclean occupation. Most Jews wouldn't do that. But Peter goes, and he doesn't just say Simon's okay, he stays with him. He lives at his house. What happened when a good Jew walked into the house of someone who was unclean? They became unclean. So Peter shows up, and maybe he remembers what happens when Jesus touched somebody who was unclean. They became clean. Yeah, the power of Jesus cleansed the uncleanliness. Where anybody else, if any of us touched someone who was unclean, their uncleanness came out, was now attached to us. But when Jesus touched them, they became clean. And Peter here, he's learned that lesson. We're going to see he's still got some fences up there about clean and unclean. He's still got some lessons to learn. But this is big progress. Peter goes and he stays with a guy who is unclean, and he stays in his house, and it doesn't bother him at all. And there may be a little foreshadowing into what's about to happen. Don't miss the tanner's name is Simon. Maybe Peter feels a little kinship there as well. Likely Simon is a Christian now. Certainly seems that way. And so he's staying with one of the brethren. And all of that leads to Acts chapter 10. And Luke kind of cuts away. We leave Peter in the tanner's house at Joppa by the sea. And there was a certain man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. So we shift again, and now we move to Caesarea. And while Jerusalem was the most important city for the Jews, Caesarea was the most important Roman city. Don't miss the word Caesar right there in the name. It was named to honor Caesar. It was the headquarters of the Roman governor over all of Palestine. It was in Caesarea that everything happened from Rome. It was officially named after Caesar Augustus, but it was always a center of emperor worship. And in Caesarea, there's a soldier named Cornelius. Cornelius is a centurion of what was called the Italian cohort. A cohort was a regiment of soldiers. At its smallest, it was about 600. At a full strength, it was about 1,000 men. A regular cohort had about 600 men, 1/10 of a legion. And he's the centurion over it. Cornelius is a common name, but it's not Jewish. It's Latin. He's a Roman through and through. He's part of the occupying force. And Cornelius shows up, and here he is, and we just meet him. And as soon as you find out there was a man called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment, you're supposed to already not like this guy. He's one of the occupiers. He's one of the enemy. He works for the Romans. As a centurion, he was responsible for just 100 soldiers. Sorry, I said he was over it. He's not that high up. We'll meet some higher up folks. But here he is, and he's got a group of men that's under him, and we don't like this guy. He's a Roman soldier. But verse 2, Luke says he's a devout man, and one who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. In spite of being a Roman soldier, somehow Cornelius is a good guy. Luke calls him a devout man. He's a God-fearer. Somehow this Roman officer had grown tired of what he'd seen in the Roman pagan religions. Somehow he had sought out truth, and he had become one who feared God. Now, a God-fearer was a specific title. That's not just, hey, he believed in God. A God-fearer was almost a Jew. If you converted to Judaism, you became a proselyte. And that meant you were a Jew, but you would say, hey, I'm a convert. I didn't grow up Jewish. I converted to Judaism. I was a proselyte. That meant you went through all the ceremonies. You went through the baptisms that they would do. You went through the quotations of Scripture. You had appeared before the rulers in the synagogue. And if you were a man, it meant that you had been circumcised as well. And you can understand why Jewish evangelistic efforts were much more popular among women than they were among men. It was, for women, here's some stuff you've got to learn and a baptism you've got to undergo and you're Jewish. For men, it was, we need to get your surgery scheduled. And that was a pretty serious obstacle. And Cornelius would have been one who had read and studied and prayed, but had not been circumcised. And those folks were called God-fearers. They were almost there. If you decide to go get your doctorate degree, there's some classes you have to take. Whatever your field is, there's classes you have to take. And if your degree is in any kind of a research field, so not medicine or anything like that, you'll have to write a dissertation. It's a really big, long paper. That's the easiest way to put it. And there are plenty of folks who are doctoral candidates, and they've completed all the classes they need. They're just still working on that paper. And they will tell you that they are a PhD, ABD, all but dissertation. They're still writing their paper. Cornelius is a Jew, all but circumcision. He's a good person. He's a God-fearer. One of the technical terms that they would use, or one of the terms that the Pharisees would use, what they would call them proselytes at the gate. He's come right to the very edge of full conversion. Cornelius is one who feared God with his whole household. He's taught his family what he's learned. He's shared his faith. He gave alms generously to the people, and he prayed to God always. What are we supposed to learn from all those descriptions of Cornelius? What's that? He's a follower of God. Here's how that shows up in his life. Luke tells us he's devout, but here's what it looks like. He teaches his family, he gives, and he prays. Does that mean those are the hallmarks of a God follower, and as long as you teach your family and give and pray, check, 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 you're a God follower? Well, he's still not saved. We're going to see that in just a minute. But is that the definition of devout? Keith says yes. Didn't we just meet Tabitha? She sews for widows. That's pretty devout too. I want you to see Luke's not giving us a checklist. It's not do these 3 things and you're devout. These are simply signs of what was going on in Cornelius' heart. And these things, along with other things, will show up in the lives of anyone who is devout. So verse 3, about the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. So about the 9th hour of the day, the Jews started counting time at daybreak, so the 9th hour would be about 3 p.m. This was one of the Jewish hours of prayer. Cornelius seems to be observing that. And as he's praying there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he sees a man standing before him, we're going to find out, in shining garments. It's an angel of the Lord. And I love that Luke tells us a couple of things. First off, he saw clearly. What are we supposed to understand by that? What does it mean he saw clearly? No doubt that he saw it. This is not like Paul who says, I don't know, I saw a bright light and I heard a voice. Paul's later going to say, I saw Jesus. Cornelius is like, nope, I could clearly see. I can describe this guy in detail. This is not a hallucination. This is not my imagination. He clearly saw an angel of the Lord, and all the angel of the Lord says is Cornelius. But how powerful would it be if an angel shows up and calls you by name? Cornelius. What did Cornelius learn in that moment that was really powerful? Say it again, Colby. God's paying attention to him. God knows my name. This is not just some angel who goes around and says, hey, here's a message for everybody. We've seen angels that do that. When Isaiah looks into heaven, there's angels who just fly around saying, holy, holy, holy. They just want everybody to hear that. This is not a generic message. This is specific. Cornelius. Now, it's pretty powerful as well. Sometimes people will tell me, God and I, we've got a special arrangement kind of worked out. I'm always skeptical of that. But Cornelius is about to get a special arrangement worked out. The angel shows up and says, Cornelius, this is for you. This is between you and God. So we ought to pay attention. You know, if there's times where you say, man, I wish I could have a special arrangement with God. You know, if he and I could just have an understanding. Man, look at Cornelius, because he gets that. Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, what is it, Lord? Cornelius is a God-fearer. He knows when angels show up. What usually happens when angels show up? Keith says things happen. At this point, Cornelius knows his Old Testament really well. What happens when an angel shows up in the Old Testament, Renee? So we always think they bring a message. It's what we're prone to think. We got Luke 2 in us, man. The angels show up with glad tidings of good news, and the angel shows up and says, Mary, you're going to have a child. Joseph, don't be afraid. We think of a message. But in the Old Testament, when an angel shows up, what usually happens next is a whole bunch of people die. Angels are soldiers. You think about how many times God sends an angel into the enemy camp and they all started fighting each other. Or God sends an angel into the enemy camp and they begin to kill one another. When angels show up, the power of God gets put on display, and a lot of times it's pretty ugly. And so Cornelius sees an angel, and he was afraid. And he says, what is it, Lord? What do you want? And so he said to him, your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. I know your name. I know what you've done. You've been giving alms. And I know what you want. I've heard your prayers. What a powerful message to open up with. God says, Cornelius, I know you. And then he's going to go on and tell him, here's what you need to know. Next week, we'll look at exactly what the angel says to Cornelius and what Cornelius needs to do. And we'll talk about when Cornelius gets a special arrangement with God, we're going to find out it's a repeat of what God tells everyone to do. Cornelius just gets it affirmed that this is for you too. The gospel really is for all. Thanks for being in Bible class this morning.